Hi, everybody. It's me, Rev Kling Meyer, and my co-Freeman here to talk about, here on Subconscious Sundays, here to talk about imagination and fantasy. And wow, this could be a long one, Tim, but I'm going to do my best to keep it brief.
Yeah, we've
Um,
got some interesting things to share on this topic today. These, I guess, two ideas, and honored to be here with you guys. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for being here. And before we dive in, I've been forgetting this the last few weeks, but we always like to set the intention for this to be a fun and entertaining and laid back way to discuss the potentially serious and heavy topics while remaining open and inviting and welcoming to those of you who have questions or ideas to respectfully bring them into the conversation.
Yes, and this is our weekly ritual with you all. We love to be able to gather our shared community here in a sacred online space to share our knowledge and experience while hearing your responses too.
Yes. And our core values are to be respectful of everyone's individual journey, rooted in compassion for self and others, promoting growth and expansion, and creating a supportive community, which we could not do without you. So thank you for joining us today. Um, so, imagination and fantasy. Well, I have a lot to bring in today with this. And it's some of it's personal, like my own personal observations. Some of it is from what I'm learning in school in international peace studies. And of course, there's always the commentary that we bring in from the topic that we bring up on Facebook. I have a prompt that I ask every Wednesday, and I make it public so everybody can weigh in who wants to. So if you're catching us on YouTube and it's the first time you've ever encountered our videos and this series, you're welcome to find me, April Kling Meyer, on Facebook and see what the topic is this week. So if we're currently doing live shows. So this week, though, I want to go back in time a little bit to last week and kind of tie in last week to this week. So last week's topic, what was it again, Tim?
Hope, hope and faith.
Open faith, right? So we talked a lot about manifestation, though. We got kind of off on a little bit on a bunny trail with that, but it was really, really pertinent. And it's also the bridge, which there was a purpose to going down that bunny trail. It was not only was it Easter, so being on a bunny trail was on theme, but also because it really is the bridge across last week's hope and faith episode of this week's imagination and fantasy episode. And what I thought was really cool was that Jill, our one of our long-term every episode viewers, said this in response to the question prompt on imagination and fantasy, and then later on told me she hadn't even seen last week's episode on hope and faith. So Jill said this, and I wanted to bring this in the self, it's a pretty good summary on that bunny trail. In the self-help community across religion, therapy, and new age approaches, there is this great attention spent on higher self or manifesting. And while these concepts are not inherently bad, they tend to press people to escape experiential reality, and in turn people avoid coping with real and present danger, or just real and present circumstance, or real and present emotions, is what I would add to what Jill is saying. And that is a point we didn't actually make last week, but I think it is kind of important to bring in. And then, of course, like I said, she must have been psychic because she hadn't even seen last week's episode when she said that, and she was applying it to this week's question, which is how do imagination and fantasy affect the way you live your life? Do you differentiate between imagination and fantasy, and if so, how? So, not a whole lot of commentary on this week. I guess for a lot of people, it's sort of not a really easy question to answer. And again, as similarly to last week, people had a lot to say about differentiating those two, but not as much to say about how they apply it. Still, some people did mention it, and I'll start with that one. So Erica really did go there with like how this applies to her life. I feel that I'm able to direct fantasy into my art, which is something that obviously resonates with me because I'm way into the creative process and the ways that creativity and spirituality are intertwined. That said, I was always told I have an overactive imagination growing up. It was only recently that I'm realizing how much power I have with imagination. Yeah, I trust in it. It feels magical. I am able to meet goals in life with imagination, thinking outside the box when an obstacle appears. So you will find that much of what I have to say today centers around what Erica is bringing into the conversation. But Jill also had this to say: fantasy and imagination are distinct from one another, but I can see how these terms can be used interchangeably. There are healthy ways to approach time spent in fantasy or imagination, and then there's dissociation. Tim, you look like you had something to say.
Well, no, actually, just kind of. I was gonna loop Jill back into this because it just seems like these two comments they kind of encapsulate a lot of the way people might think about using imagination in their life. They might either think like, I need to be grounded here in this reality and the experience that we're having here. Like we're adults in the world and having to navigate all this, and then Erica says that she's constructively kind of using imagination in her life to like help with this everyday reality. So I just thought that was really, I think it's really common, these two ways of thinking about it or using it.
Definitely. And we'll so be talking about that today. Absolutely. Christine says fantasy is a tool to escape the solid form, manipulate it so as to work out and engage with complexes. Imagination is divine form coming from a fateful constellation that is entering thought process to guide and inspire. Fantasy is like sugar drug or drugs. They can be used in moderation without dire consequences that can lead to demise. Imagination is pure, it's play, it's visioning, and it's soul led. So that is pretty much the gist of what was brought into the conversation today. And I'm not really going to say anything too different from what's already being said, but I will say that the implications to other things we've talked about in the past on this show, and also the ways that we differentiate and combine imagination and fantasy will be kind of the focus of what I'm talking about today. And I'm also going to be bringing in some other voices who have something to say on the topic. So that will be what we will talk about today. So I agree with Christine that imagination, and I think it's also kind of across the different commenters that we brought today, that imagination is a tool that we can utilize. And when grounded in reality, it tends to be focused on what is and what could be. So there's a certain more realistic tinge to what imagination is about and what it centers around. And using our minds constructively to set goals and ambitions, develop a sense of purpose, and gain direction. So that tends to be imagination, tends to be the ways in which we kind of project ourselves into the future, or it can be a way that we see our present circumstances. And then when it's based in fear, the shadow side of imagination would be, of course, anxiety. And this is in contrast to fantasy, which tends to be more of a distraction, sort of like what Christine was saying. It's a bit more ungrounded in reality. And this might be a bit of a leap, but bear with me here. It's more about what could have or might have been, as opposed to what I said about imagination, which is kind of more about the present and the future. It's a little bit more focused on the past. And when I was taking my notes on this broadcast for today, I thought about like the idea of fantasy in fiction, about how when we differentiate sci-fi and fantasy, we tend to see sci-fi as something that is taking taking place in the present or the future, and we tend to see fantasy as something that took place in the past. Um, and I think about the costuming for each of those. And that's really kind of one way to differentiate those two genres of fiction. So that could be one way we think about the two of these different ideas, right? Using our minds constructively in fantasy, because sort of disagree with the idea that that one is constructive and one isn't, or that one is more constructive than the other. I think they both have pretty strong shadows, and they both have pretty strong applications. So using it constructively, dreaming, whether it be daydreaming or the type of dreaming that we have at night, I think that tends to be more of a fantasy than an imagination, because it's a little bit more tangible in a way that there's form around it. And then creativity, I definitely think imagination plays into creativity, but the fantasy that um, the reason I'm putting it in kind of the fantasy category is because creativity kind of involves anything and everything rather than it being so grounded in reality, especially a lot of the more abstract forms of creativity. Um, Shamanic journeying and hypnosis, which I know you're very passionate about. And the shadow side of fantasy being when based in fear is nostalgia, melancholy, or as Jill put it, dissociation. So we get kind of further and further away from the possible and the real when we are engaged in fantasy rather than imagination. And again, there is a lot of overlap here. These two terms are very interchangeable. I don't My purpose on the show is not really to be in the business of linguistics or semantics, but in order to set the tone of the conversation and set the tone of Tim's hypnosis session, that is how we are identifying these definitions. So, remaining grounded and present, just to sum it up, we use imagination to seek possibilities, identify opportunities, and realize our potential, whereas fantasy is used to open our minds, expand our horizons, and receive healing. So I wanted to kind of also mention that in the teachings of, say, Course in Miracles, that what we what we typically refer to as real or reality is actually a dream or an imagination or something that we're typically very, very engaged in fantasy. And and that is a bit of a esoteric concept, but just a reminder that in that particular faith path, Course in Miracles, the only thing that's real is love and everything else is illusion. So that's the first time I've mentioned the term illusion. And I think we're talking about, now, Tim, you may have a different idea on this, but I think when we're talking about imagination and fantasy, we're talking about ways we use illusion. And that is not a reference to the Guns N' Roses albums, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. And then I wanted to also bring in the voices of Eckhart Tolle, the voice of Eckhart Tolle as well, that it's important to suspend our expectations, which is sort of like an imagination based idea, like these idea that we kind of project our realities into the future and set expectations and respond. And it's important that we respond to all imaginations of our future with uh, deep a deep-seated, like inner deep self response saying, maybe, like, I imagine that things could go a certain way, bad or good, or even neutral. I can just simply remind myself anytime I'm setting an expectation, maybe. And that tends to eliminate a great deal of disappointment. I think the main point here is to do our best to stay grounded in the present and also to suspend expectation in order to promote joy in our lives. And then I also wanted to bring in something I'm learning about imagination, particularly in peace work. And that is something that Anik Wibben wrote. And there's two different quotes from a writing called Piecing Up Feminist Peace Research. And there's two different quotes I wanted to share. I couldn't decide which one I liked better, so I decided to include them both. And that is: a grounded perspective on the ongoing conflict inverses the lens of violence and makes us see the ongoing struggle emerging from an imagination of a peaceful future. And then the other one is: grounding our imagination of possible futures is what is already known to us, our everyday lives, the wisdom of our elders, the stories told by generations before us is crucial. So, to sum up what Anik is saying in these quotes, the idea, and I am going about 2 episodes back talking about peace again, but the idea that we will achieve any sort of peace in our lives or any peace in the world relies heavily upon a grounded sense, a grounded perspective in the use of our imaginations and the use of our imaginations, period, because without imagination, peace is not possible. So that is what I wanted to bring into the conversation today.
Yeah, this is really interesting points there. I think, a question that popped up for me is in terms of grounding in our reality. It's a lot of times when we have a hard time enjoying inner peace or making a change in our lives, there's an inner conflict. And so it seems like we could view this as like there's a conflict between imagination and reality, like our hard reality here. I think if we can divorce this, like if we can view these as not opposing forces, but kind of they're both inherent and important parts of our experience, our waking reality and all of these practical things that we have to do to live our lives each day, or that we believe we do. And then also allowing some imagination to open up that field of possibilities that could be our reality, right? And they're both inherent. When we're kids, we're all imagination, right?
Mhm.
We're not all practicality yet. And, somehow when we get to be an adult, it's like, got to be all practical, and like imagination is fantasy. And, it's kind of, I don't have time for that. But think about this. One way that's very pointed in the way that these two are integrated is you hear about professional athletes using hypnosis or just imagination. They are living in their mind. They're living through step by step each of the acts that they're going to take in whatever sport or event that they're doing, right?
Mhm.
And they're seeing it in their mind's eye. They're living it in their mind's eye. That is a very good example of ways in which we can constructively use imagination in our lives in a very like down to earth, like practical way, right?
Right.
And of course, you can think of all kinds of other ways or whatever. But what I do know is as adults, we do squelch our inherent imagination to some
Yeah.
extent,
Yeah. We talked
right?
about when we were brainstorming for this episode, we talked about when we undergo something like hypnosis or in shamanic journeys is another perfect example of this, or even lucid dreaming. We tend to do that discounting that you were just talking about.
Yeah,
We tend to
discounting.
discount ourselves in the way that we had been discounted as children, and telling ourselves that we're just imagining that everything that we're experiencing in that hypnotic state or that shamanic state or that dream state was just fantasy. Now, these are the types of things that tend to get in the way of our healing process and get in the way. it's not that it isn't fantasy, it's just that it's kind of beside the point that it is fantasy. It's kind of this other reality, this other version of reality that we can go into to get what we need from it, and that it doesn't matter if it's fantasy. But the problem with that is that in if you're in that type of healing modality, if you're doing lucid dreaming, if you're doing a hypnosis session, or if you're doing a shamanic journey, you may completely eliminate whatever potential healing is available to you by just simply telling yourself that that is not valid, and completely invalidating it as just fantasy. Well, fantasy in you, it is fantasy. It's fantasy in use to your higher growth. And if I am remembering what you have taught me, Tim, pop quiz, that would be an incidence of the critical factor. Is that right?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. The critical factor is kind of like a gatekeeper between our conscious and our subconscious minds. It's what our thinking mind says, like, no, that's not, no, that's not possible, or oh, I don't accept that. And what we're talking about is beliefs and the development of beliefs, right? What you just pointed out, the development of the belief of, oh, that's just fantasy. So a lot of possibilities are limited by this, by our beliefs and possibly this kind of gatekeeper.
Mhm.
Um, so cultivating a stronger connection between our conscious and our subconscious minds allows for us to really first of all, really evaluate our beliefs around all of this. It allows us to open up some possibilities beyond what we might be limited by with this critical factor kind of function of our mind, right?
Right. Exactly.
But some might say thought forms of any kind, fantasy, imagination, whatever, that in some level of reality, these thought forms are, it's a form. So what
Right.
we think does become a reality in some level, but you know, let's just take it down to, like, reality, our lived experience. I had this, you brought up shamanic journeying, and I'll never forget, I took a really awesome course in my undergrad studies on shamanism. My advisor was a shamanic practitioner, researched with shamanic tribes all around the world, and had this like crazy awesome experience with researching that. So she's a real expert on it. And, I had this question. It's like, how do I know that what I'm seeing or experiencing in this state, in this shamanic journey, is real? Like, isn't it just my imagination? Right. And I'll never forget her answer to that question. And I've chewed on it for years now. She said, well, when you're asleep and you're dreaming, is that not your reality in that moment? Well, yes, it is. And so I guess, when you're in a state where you've quieted your thinking mind, maybe you're in a shamanic state of consciousness, or you're in hypnosis or in deep meditation, um, whatever is there in your mind, is that not your reality in that moment? And if we echo back to Eckhart Tolle, who we brought into the conversation, the only reality is the present moment. So that's our experience. That's reality, right?
That's right.
So, so I wanted to bring that in on this topic of fantasy and imagination. But also, April, you had something good to say about fantasy that I think is really relevant here for people. Fantasy versus imagination. It's not super useful to like distinguish them into their own little boxes, but there are some subtle differences. And
Mhm.
fantasy can act as a distractor for us,
Right. Jill's the one who
in a
brought
way.
that into the conversation. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that's a valid point that needs to be brought in here. Um, Fantasy can be a distractor for us to move around an unpleasant feeling to just kind of make us feel better in the moment, right?
Right, right. Fantasy has this kind of tinge as opposed to imagination in the ways that they are subtly different. Fantasy has this tinge of desire to it. Like it has fantasy has kind of like this even though it's kind of like the beyond realm, beyond
Hmm.
imagination is a little bit more grounded, fantasy is completely ungrounded. And it has this kind of tinge of like desire, especially in like the realm of sexuality. Like sexual fantasies are about the things we want to do with our sexual partners, or, the things that we imagine ourselves doing sexually. And fantasy has this ability to kind of take us out of reality and into a completely desire led way of thinking of your life. And it's dissociative, but it that's one shadow side of the fact that there's a lot that could be said about being desire led. In fact, we could probably do a really good episode about that sometime. Make a note of that. Being desire led can really open us up to this idea of the elimination of shame, the elimination of limiting beliefs, and going into a place where we're really conscious of and evaluative of our desires, and fantasy can help with that. So,
Sure. Yeah, and to pose that with imagination, I encountered somewhere when we were talking about this, or when we were kind of preparing for this broadcast, the desire led, or like kind of an expectation based or outcome based nature of fantasy that could be there. And imagination, I've heard people describe, can tend to be a little bit more kind of like Christine said, it's like soul led, or like it's more like a heart desire kind of situation. I think both can be completely outside of the realm of what we might view as a real potential, or whatever, right,
mhm.
in this physical reality. But imagination tends to come from a deeper place, I think, and
Mm,
fantasy is a little more surface level, a little bit more like, think about you know like in how art is so deeply inspired by imagination and fantasy, but there's a qualitative difference that you might say, like, okay, well, like a cartoon character like Mickey Mouse, like you could kind of say that's like pure fantasy, right? Like it's kind of there's, he could teach some good lessons to kids, whatever, but it's a fantasy. Like it's not reality. It's completely divorced from reality, right?
right, right.
And then think about the imagination that gets poured into some of the great works of art, even if they are abstract and not based in reality. Like there's something deeper there that they've tapped into, right?
Hmm. It's almost like imagination is like the earth and fire elements, and fantasy is like the air and water elements, in a way that I'm probably not going to be able to articulate within the limitations of this episode, but it just feels like that's important to bring in because I'm thinking along those
Yeah.
lines a lot right now.
Yeah, I mean, in kind of esoteric thought, or like occult, thinking, those elemental qualities. I think, I follow what you're saying there. Earth and fire being kind of like action, like how we're acting in the world, and earth being like kind of bringing that imagination into the physical reality. I agree with you. I think imagination is a little more earthy and fiery than watery
Yeah,
and airy, right?
yeah. And Bear, our stalwart companion here, Bear says the imagination in fantasy spaces, bringing a new dimension into this. Bear is saying imagination in fantasy spaces are one of the few havens that are truly private. I feel the same way about my yoga practice. It's mine, and I only have to share it if I feel called to. That's so important
Yeah.
because I was just watching this really, really wild movie the other day starring oh gosh, I can't think of it. Nicolas Cage. Yes. And it was about how dreams can be hacked, and how the ad industry, like in that movie, the ad industry was starting to figure out ways to hack the dream space. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been saying this for years. I was watching it with somebody, and I was like, I have been saying this for years, that we need to be conscious of this sort of thing. It's like one of our imaginations and our fantasies are ours. They're wholly ours. They're wholly private for as long as we can keep them that way. And they're not
Yeah.
really influenced so much by outside sources unless we let them. And our subconscious is a very private space as well, and we have to be really super cognizant of who we let in. I've been saying that a lot. I've
Yeah,
been saying
and
that from
think
the
about
beginning.
ads. I mean, you mentioned ads, you pulled that into this. Like ads are a great form of mass hypnosis, if you will,
Hmm.
uh,
Yep.
by
Repetition.
looping people's belief structures and their subconscious into this fantasy that, they can only attain if they buy this thing, right? Um, and so it's this thinking like I'll only be this if I have this. But back to Bear's point though, thanks for bringing this in, Bear. It's kind of what I was wanting to say a little bit earlier, where when we're children, like we've got way more imagination, and then so any ways that we can find find an outlet as an adult to, I don't know, I don't want to say indulge our imagination, to exercise our imagination as adults. I think we have a real deficit. I mean, you might call that play. Like we have a real deficit of play as adults in our modern society. So, and then not only that, but it is a private space, right? It's a private space. We need more of that quiet time where we're able to turn down our thinking mind, and get really in tune with ourselves instead of always being externally oriented on what's you know expected of us or practical.
What a perfect segue to your hypnotic meditation.
Yeah,
I'll
and
let you
I've
take it
got
away.
something really, yeah, great, thank you. I've got something really, really short today for you guys. Research tells us that in order to enter a trance state, it usually takes at least about 8 minutes. So you might consider that, if you're, many of our viewers might be avid meditators. You might already kind of realize that. So if you're taking that time for yourself to cultivate a deeper connection between your conscious and your subconscious minds with meditation, self hypnosis, usually about 8 minutes to kind of get into that alpha brainwave state where you've really quieted the thinking mind. We're going to do something real quick today. I just want to share a tool with you guys that was developed by my um, extraordinary hypnosis teacher, Erica. It's called the two breath hypnosis technique. And I like how it's a practical application of imagination that we can use anytime during the day. So I know April's focused on peace studies with her academics right now. And we've, in previous episodes, looped this back into, world. What the idea we expressed a couple weeks ago is, world peace can really only be attained if we're all sort of like having a focus on some inner peace too. So this technique is all about inner peace, and it is a cool application of imagination that, and I found this technique to be extremely helpful. I pulled it out of my back pocket. I can't even tell you how many times, and it's helpful. So it's really simple. First of all, just settle into a comfortable position. Maybe uncross your legs, uncross your arms, just kind of settle in. Seated. Again, this is a technique that I want you to be able to pull out of your back pocket at any time. You'd be standing in line at the grocery store. You don't have to be seated and get into a comfortable. But while I'm teaching you this, go ahead and settle into a comfortable position. And when you're ready, close your eyes, taking a deep breath. And as you exhale, I want you to imagine a color that represents peace, tranquility, calm, satisfaction, colors in your mind's eye right now. Now imagine a color that represents stress, anxiety, tension. Good. You've got two colors now. And taking another deep breath. And as you exhale, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is being you're in Ananda, you're feeling so good, peaceful. A 1 is you're about to run out of the room because you're so anxious. Where are you at right now on that scale of 1 to 10? And taking another deep breath, and as you do, breathe in that color that represents peace and tranquility. As you breathe it in, let it fill up your entire body. Taking another deep breath, bring in that color, breathe in the color of peace, tranquility. Let it infuse every muscle, cell in your body. This time, as you exhale, breathe out that color that represents stress, anxiety, and tension. Breathe it all the way out with a really long exhalation. Next inhalation, breathe, once again, bring it in that color of peace and tranquility. Let it fill up your entire body. And as you exhale, breathe out that color that represents stress, tension, and anxiety, and get all of that color out. Good. And when you're feeling better, open your eyes. And now, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel? 10 is you're feeling the most peaceful you've ever felt in your whole life. 1 is you're about to have a panic attack. Notice how that shifted for you. That's it. That's the 2-breath hypnosis technique. Really quick, we didn't go into a trance state. We didn't take 8 minutes and do a formal induction. But I wanted to share this quick and easy technique. It's kind of an everyday use of imagination to help modulate your state and cultivate a deeper connection between your conscious and your subconscious mind.
That's been very useful for me too. Tim did a hypnosis session with me about a year ago, and I still have those colors in my mind that I go to whenever
Awesome.
that occurs for me. And what was so amazing to me about that was that where I sit, and you can't see it from, of course, this angle, but across the room for me, hanging on a curtain rod, is a set of they're prayer flags, but they're not Tibetan. They're like just kind of all of these different words. And I looked up, and the one for peace was the one that I had chosen in that hypnosis for my calm color.
Awesome.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
and this, I see this, this kind of echoes through my experience too, and outside of that technique. But you'll often, if you're gonna do the technique, like you don't have to stick to any particular colors. Just throwing this out there too. There's no really wrong way to do this technique. It's pretty easy. You can teach it to kids. Kids love it. Um, your colors might change though. What's important is as you're imagining like peace and tranquility, what's the first impression? What's that first color that pops? It might change. It might stay the same color the whole time every time you practice it, and you can kind of use that in your life with art or whatever else. But the colors might change, and that's okay. Just kind of roll with the first impression.
Awesome. Yeah, very useful tool. So before we bounce off of here, before we wind up this week's episode, we wanted to always, always, always make it clear to you that we are available to you to help you with whatever you're going through right now in achieving a greater sense of peace, a greater sense of calm, a greater sense of what your imagination is for. And the best way to do that is to set an appointment with us. We include a link to book a free session with us that is introductory in nature, in the description of every single episode that we do. And that's going to appear on both our Facebook and our YouTube descriptions on the events that we set up, and on all of the YouTube episodes. All you have to do, if you're watching this and you're not watching it live, you're watching it pre-recorded, you just go down into the description and find the link to book a time with Tim or to book a time with me. With Tim, you're going to get a hypnotic session. If you're
Well,
working
I
with
want to
him,
clarify that too.
yeah,
I just
okay,
want to clarify that.
yeah,
If you want to schedule some time with me, it's a consultation. Usually my clients will come to me because they have a problem they want to solve.
right.
So this is a consultation to get to know that problem a little bit better and answer all your questions about hypnosis. And then from there, we can make a decision if we want to move forward with hypnosis sessions. I usually work with folks between 4 and 6 sessions on average. So this is not going to be a hypnosis session. I'll offer you my best guidance in the consultation, but it is a consultation.
Right. And in the case of myself, it's not going to be a full counseling session. It's going to, or even any guidance. It's really just going to be a chance for you to kick my tires and get to know me, get to be comfortable with me, and then we can move into the real work. But if you decide to move forward with that, you'll be doing hypnosis with Tim, and you'll be doing a little bit more of the talking things out and being heard, seen, and understood with me. So we have found that there are benefits to working with both of this at the same time. So if that's of interest to you, if you want to stagger those appointments a little bit, we have ways of packaging that. So make it known to either one of us, if you book an appointment with either one of us, if that is an option you'd like to consider, and that we are definitely open to that in working in tandem with you to make your life feel like a better place to live in. And that's about all we have for today. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you next week. Our topic will be alone and together. So we'll be talking about the merits of both and the ways in which we can think of ourselves as part of a community and the ways in which we empower ourselves as individuals. So we hope to see you next week. Thanks again for joining us, and have a blessed rest of your Sunday.